Imagine a nation of 850 million people, a proud, independent democracy brought to its knees. Imagine it has so little money left, it can only afford to buy the most essential goods, oil, food, medicine, for just 3 more weeks. After that, default, economic collapse. For the average citizen, this wasn't an abstract economic problem. It was the looming threat of empty shelves, skyrocketing prices for basic necessities, and a future of profound uncertainty. This wasn't a hypothetical. This was India in the summer of 1991. The country was facing a catastrophic balance of payments crisis. Its foreign exchange reserves had dwindled to just over $1 billion, barely enough to survive. The government was on the verge of defaulting on its international loans for the first time in its history. What happened next was an act of national desperation shrouded in secrecy. To secure an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, the government was forced to do the unthinkable: pledge its own gold. But this wasn't a paper transaction. They had to physically fly the nation's sovereign wealth out of the country. The operation was carried out with the utmost secrecy, fearing public backlash and political turmoil. In a series of clandestine flights, 67 tons of Indian gold were airlifted to the Bank of England and the Union Bank of Switzerland as collateral. When the news eventually broke, it sent shockwaves of outrage and humiliation across the country. The idea that India, a nation that prided itself on its sovereignty, had to pawn its gold, was a deep psychological blow. The Chandrasekhar government, which authorized the airlift, could not withstand the political firestorm and collapsed within months. How did it come to this? How did a country that had championed self-reliance for 4 decades find itself pawning the family jewels just to keep the lights on? This is the story of the crisis that pushed India to the brink, and the radical, controversial revolution that followed. The week India changed forever. To understand the crisis of 1991, you have to go back to 1947. After centuries of colonial rule, a newly independent India was determined to forge its own path. Its leaders, inspired by socialist ideals and wary of foreign exploitation, chose a model of state-led development and economic self-sufficiency. This was the era of the socialist pattern of society, where the state would control the commanding heights of the economy. The goal was noble: to protect nascent Indian industries, promote equality, and guide investment through 5-year plans, similar to the Soviet Union. The Industrial Development Regulation Act of 1951 and the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956 established a framework where strategic industries like armaments, atomic energy, and railways were state monopolies, while others required government approval for almost any action. But the reality was a complex, suffocating web of government controls that came to be known as the License Raj. For 40 years, almost every aspect of private business was controlled. To start a company, you needed a license. To expand production, you needed a license. To produce a new product, a license. To import a single piece of machinery, a license. By some estimates, an entrepreneur had to satisfy up to 80 different government agencies just to get started. This system created absurdities that actively punished ambition and innovation. Take the story of N.R. Narayana Murthy, who would later co-found the IT giant Infosys. In the 1980s, it took him 3 years and over 50 trips to Delhi just to get a license to import one computer. He wasn't alone. Entrepreneurs across the country spent more time navigating bureaucracy than innovating. The system forced a focus on compliance over competition, creating a generation of businesses that were reactive rather than proactive. The License Raj benefited those who could navigate its corrupt corridors, large established corporations and the bureaucrats who held the power of the stamp. It stifled competition, protected inefficient public sector monopolies, and made it nearly impossible for small businesses to grow. This concentration of economic power in the hands of a few large corporations was a direct consequence of a system that made it difficult for smaller players to even enter the market. The result was decades of sluggish economic performance. While other Asian nations were taking off, India was stuck in what economists derisively called the Hindu rate of growth, a meager 3 to 4% per year. Between 1950 and 1980, India's economy grew at an average annual rate of just 1% in per capita terms. Compare that to the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. During the same period, they were experiencing explosive growth, often exceeding 7% annually. By 1980, their GDP per capita had at least tripled, while India's had barely moved. While India's GDP per capita was $271 in 1980, South Korea's had grown to over $1,715. India was being left behind, trapped in a cage of its own making. But the License Raj wasn't just a collection of bad policies. It was a deeply entrenched ideology. Born from the trauma of colonial economic extraction, the idea of a self-reliant, state-controlled economy became intertwined with patriotism itself. This socialist pattern of society was seen as a defense of India's hard-won independence. The nationalization of major banks in 1969 and 1980 was a landmark expression of this philosophy, cementing state control over the financial sector. This created a powerful political and intellectual paralysis. Any attempt at reform, like a brief effort in 1966, was immediately attacked as a betrayal of national sovereignty, a surrender to foreign interests. The system was visibly failing, but the alternative seemed ideologically unthinkable. It would take a crisis of existential proportions to force a change. By the mid-1980s, the cracks in the system were becoming impossible to ignore. The government was spending far more than it earned, leading to a massive fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit rose from 8% of GDP in 1980 to 85 to over 10.4% in 1990 to 91. At the same time, the country was importing more than it was exporting, creating a large current account deficit. India was living on borrowed money and borrowed time. To finance these deficits, India's external debt nearly doubled in just 6 years, from $38 billion in 1985 to $84 billion by 1991. Much of this new borrowing was short-term commercial debt, making the economy dangerously vulnerable to shifts in international confidence. This reliance on high-cost, short-maturity financing heightened the risk of a liquidity crunch. Then, in 1990, a series of external shocks hit, one after another, turning a chronic illness into an acute emergency. First, the Gulf War. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait sent global oil prices soaring. For India, a major oil importer, the bill swelled by $2 billion overnight. The war also meant that remittances from Indian workers in the Gulf, a key source of foreign currency, dried up, and the government faced the additional burden of repatriating and rehabilitating its citizens from the conflict zone. At the same time, the world was watching the collapse of the Soviet Union. For India, this was an economic catastrophe. The USSR was its largest trading partner, and that entire market, which facilitated trade via rupee exchange, vanished almost instantly. Just when India needed strong leadership most, its political system descended into chaos. A weak coalition government under VP Singh fell in late 1990, and the subsequent caretaker government under Chandrasekhar was unable to pass a budget. This political instability triggered a devastating credit rating downgrade by Moody's to junk status in February 1991. Suddenly, borrowing money on international markets became nearly impossible. International confidence evaporated. Investors pulled their money out. Credit dried up. And then, in the middle of the 1991 general election, the unthinkable happened. Former Prime Minister and Congress Party leader Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. The nation was left shocked, grieving, and rudderless, sailing directly into the eye of a perfect economic storm. The 1991 crisis was not a single event, but a cascade failure. The underlying economic weaknesses created by the License Raj were the dry tinder. Geopolitical shocks like the Gulf War and the Soviet collapse were the sparks that lit the fire, simultaneously driving up import costs while slashing export earnings and remittances. This immense pressure was then amplified by political instability. A weak government, unable to pass a budget, shattered international confidence, leading to a credit downgrade that cut off the financial lifelines the country desperately needed. Each crisis fed the next, creating a vicious feedback loop that accelerated the nation's slide toward default. Out of the chaos of the 1991 election emerged one of the most unlikely prime ministers in India's history. P.V. Narasimha Rao was a quiet, scholarly politician from South India. At 70 years old, he had all but retired from politics. He was literally packing his bags to move back to his village when the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi thrust him back into the spotlight. He was an accidental prime minister, leading a minority government with just 244 seats in parliament, short of the majority needed to govern effectively. He was seen as a placeholder, a man without a strong political base, and certainly not a revolutionary. But this perception would prove to be his greatest strength. He was a seasoned administrator, having held key portfolios like foreign minister. But he was not part of the inner circle of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, which gave him a degree of independence. Rao's first and most important decision was a masterstroke. For his finance minister, he didn't choose a powerful politician. He chose an academic. Dr. Manmohan Singh was a Cambridge-educated economist, a former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and at the time, the chairman of the University Grants Commission. He was a technocrat, not a politician, and he had a clear vision of what needed to be done. As Singh himself later recalled, the phone call from Rao's office came late at night, summoning him to an urgent meeting. He was so surprised by the offer to become finance minister that he didn't initially take it seriously. But Rao was insistent. He knew he needed an expert, not a populist, to navigate the treacherous economic waters. Rao recognized that the crisis was an opportunity to push through reforms that were ideologically unthinkable just months earlier. Together, this unlikely duo faced a monumental task. The reforms they needed to implement, devaluation, privatization, opening up to foreign competition, were political poison. They went against 40 years of Congress Party ideology. The Indian left vociferously opposed the capitalist reforms, predicting a rapid descent for the economy. The opposition from within their own party was immense, with many powerful leaders remaining staunch socialists. This is where Rao's political genius came into play. He acted as a political shield, a shock absorber for Dr. Singh. In tense party meetings, Rao would often let Singh face the criticism alone, allowing MPs to vent their anger at the technocrat while the Prime Minister remained above the fray, quietly building consensus behind the scenes. Rao cleverly framed the reforms as a continuation of Rajiv Gandhi's vision, which helped to placate some of the dissenters within the party. He engaged with opposition leaders, neutralized critics, and gave his finance minister the political cover to light the fuse on an economic revolution. As Manmohan Singh later said, "Without his support, I could do nothing." On July 24, 1991, Dr. Manmohan Singh rose in Parliament to deliver what would become the most important budget speech in India's history. He began by acknowledging the depth of the crisis, stating the country was at the edge of a precipice with foreign reserves for a mere fortnight. But this was not a speech of despair. It was a call to action. He declared that over-centralization and excessive bureaucratization have proved to be counterproductive. He argued that the time had come to expose Indian industry to competition from abroad, and in a now famous line, he quoted Victor Hugo, "No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come." The budget laid out a radical new blueprint for the Indian economy, centered on three pillars: liberalization, privatization, and globalization, LPG. First, liberalization. The hated license Raj was dismantled. Industrial licensing was abolished for all but 18 strategic sectors, such as defense, atomic energy, and hazardous chemicals. businesses were finally free to produce and expand based on market demand, not bureaucratic whim. Second, privatization. The state's monopoly was broken. The number of industries reserved for the public sector was slashed from 17 to just 8, and later to 3. The government began a process of disinvestment, selling shares in inefficient public sector undertakings, PSUs, to encourage private participation and accountability. And third, globalization. India opened its doors to the world. The rupee was devalued by nearly 20% to make exports competitive. Cripplingly high import tariffs, some over 300%, were slashed. And most importantly, foreign direct investment was not just allowed, but welcomed. The limit for foreign equity was raised from 40% to 51% in high-priority industries, signaling that India was open for business. The results were immediate and staggering. The economy, on the brink of collapse, roared back to life. After slumping to just 1.06% growth in 1991, GDP growth surged to 5.48% in 1992 and averaged over 6.5% for the rest of the decade. Foreign investment, which was a trickle of $73.5 million in 1991, became a flood, reaching $2.14 billion by 1996. Foreign exchange reserves, which had bottomed out at $5.6 billion, were rebuilt to comfortable levels within months, and a new engine of the Indian economy was born. The reforms, especially the zero duty on software imports and the creation of software technology parks, laid the foundation for India's world-beating IT and software services sector. Companies like Infosys and Wipro, once shackled by the license raj, were now free to compete on the global stage, kicking off a boom that continues to this day. But the story of 1991 is not a simple fairy tale of success. The same reforms that unleashed unprecedented growth also unleashed unprecedented inequality. As the billionaire Raj replaced the license Raj, the gap between the rich and the poor widened dramatically. According to a study co-authored by economist Thomas Piketty, by 2022, the top 1% of Indians held over 40% of the nation's wealth, while their income share was 22.6%, the highest levels recorded since 1922. Oxfam reports that the top 10% hold a staggering 77% of the total national wealth. This level of inequality is now higher than it was during the British colonial era. While urban India boomed, rural India was often left behind. The reforms led to a sharp reduction in public investment and subsidies for agriculture. Farmers, encouraged to switch from food crops to cash crops like cotton, were suddenly exposed to the volatility of global markets and the high costs of new seeds and pesticides from multinational corporations. As journalist P. Nath has extensively documented, this created a vicious cycle of debt. When crops failed or prices crashed, small farmers, unable to get credit from nationalized banks, turned to private moneylenders charging exorbitant interest rates. Trapped and humiliated, an epidemic of farmer suicides swept across the country. Between 1995 and 2018, nearly 400,000 farmers took their own lives, a tragedy that continues to this day. The agrarian crisis became a social crisis, as millions left farming but found no jobs elsewhere, a civilizational crisis of humanity. There was another paradox. Despite high GDP growth, the economy failed to create enough formal jobs, a phenomenon known as jobless growth. The manufacturing sector, expected to be the engine of employment, stagnated. Employment elasticity, the rate of job growth relative to output growth, collapsed in the 1990s, falling from 0.51 in the pre-reform decade to just 0.15 in the post-reform years. At the same time, the push for fiscal discipline meant that public spending on social sectors like health and education, as a percentage of GDP, stagnated or even declined in the initial years. This led to a rise in out-of-pocket healthcare expenses, pushing millions into poverty, and a growing reliance on private education, deepening the divide between the haves and have-nots. The reforms of 1991 were designed as macroeconomic shock therapy. The primary goal was survival. Avoid default, stabilize the currency, and attract foreign capital. This approach, often part of the IMF and World Bank playbook, prioritizes fiscal stability over social safety nets. The withdrawal of the state from key sectors like agriculture and social spending was a core part of this strategy. However, India's rural and poor populations were deeply dependent on this state support. Removing it without a robust alternative safety net created a vacuum. This vacuum was filled by volatile global markets for farmers, expensive private services for health and education, and a formal job market that couldn't absorb the workforce. The result was not just inequality, but deep-seated social distress, farmer suicides, jobless growth, and worsening human development indicators for the poor that were the direct, albeit perhaps unintended, consequences of the single-minded focus on macroeconomic stabilization. The reforms saved the economy, but at a tremendous social cost that India is still grappling with. In a particularly cruel twist, some studies found that in the aftermath of the reforms, certain forms of child labor actually increased. While the overall trend in the post-reform era has been a decline in child labor, the initial shock had complex effects. The 1986 Child Labor Act, intended to prohibit child labor, had an unintended consequence when combined with the economic shifts of 1991. The ban lowered wages for children, and for the poorest families who relied on this income to meet basic subsistence needs, the only response was to send more children to work. This increase in child labor often came at the cost of school enrollment, trapping another generation in a cycle of poverty. So, what is the final verdict on 1991? It was, without a doubt, the most profound turning point in modern Indian history. It was a high-stakes gamble taken at a moment of existential crisis. The men who led it, P.V. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, steered a minority government through a political minefield to rewrite the destiny of a nation. The gamble paid off in spectacular fashion. It pulled India back from the brink of collapse, unleashed the creative energy of its entrepreneurs, and integrated a once isolated giant into the global economy. The India of today, a nuclear power, a tech hub, and the world's fifth largest economy, is a direct product of the reforms of 1991. But that same gamble created a deeply fractured nation. A billionaire Raj of staggering wealth coexists with persistent poverty. A booming service sector has not been matched by jobs for the masses. And the agrarian crisis remains a painful, open wound on the soul of the country. The reforms created winners and losers on a scale India had never seen before. 30 years on, India stands at another crossroads. The world that 1991 opened up is changing. The challenges are no longer about dismantling state control, but about managing the consequences of the market. Can India create enough jobs for the millions entering the workforce each year? Can it bridge the vast chasm of inequality? Can it achieve growth that is not just fast, but also fair and sustainable? The week India changed forever set the nation on a new path. But the journey is far from over. The next chapter of India's story will be defined by how it answers the questions that 1991 left in its wake.